The air in Georgia hung thick in July, like a warm, damp blanket that refused to be shaken off. It was the kind of summer where the scent of cut grass mixed with the tang of charcoal, and the cicadas sang loud enough to drown out one's thoughts. In their little town, summer always meant one thing: the annual neighborhood BBQ. It had been Walter's idea years ago, and the tradition stuck. Every July, without fail, Joanne and Walter opened their backyard, fired up the smoker, and turned their home into the beating heart of the block. It was tradition, and Joanne had always loved tradition, the comfort of knowing some things stayed the same. But this year, something felt different. Joanne wasn't a woman who jumped at shadows. After 41 years of marriage, she knew the difference between paranoia and instinct. Lately, her instincts had been whispering to her, not with the scream of sudden disaster, but with the slow, steady pulse of warning. It had started months earlier. Walter had developed a new hobby, or rather, a new person to help. Their neighbor, Lila Hayes, had moved in across the street a year ago. She was in her late 30s, newly divorced, and the kind of woman who seemed to always be holding court in her own little drama, loud laughter, short shorts, and a way of leaning into conversations that made others feel like they were the only ones who mattered in that moment. The first time Lila came over, she carried a peach pie, all smiles and sweetness. "For your hospitality," she had said, glancing at Walter a second longer than necessary. Joanne told herself it was nothing. But as the months passed, she noticed more the way Walter's voice softened when he spoke to Lila, how he just happened to be outside whenever Lila was unloading groceries. One Saturday, Joanne caught him carrying Lila's lawn chairs into her backyard when they were supposed to be heading to their grandson's ball game. Walter brushed it off. "She needed a hand, Joe. You know me can't say no when someone asks for help." It was plausible. It was always plausible. Until it wasn't. For this year's BBQ, Walter seemed almost excited in a way Joanne hadn't seen in a long time. Not because family was coming in from Macon, not for the music or the ribs, but because, as he put it, Lila offered to help with the prep this year. Help, as in showing up on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday before the event, wearing sundresses that clung in the July humidity. Joanne often found them in the backyard, Walter showing Lila the right way to handle the smoker tongs, Lila laughing like he'd just told the cleverest joke in the county. Joanne tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that perhaps age was making her more sensitive. But then, last week, she caught a look pass between them. It was quick, gone in an instant, but it was the kind of look one doesn't misinterpret. Not after 4 decades of marriage. It wasn't friendly. It was loaded. So Joanne smiled. She set the menu. She ironed the tablecloths and polished the serving platters. Because if there was one thing she had learned in 66 years, it was that you never charged into battle without knowing the terrain. The night before the BBQ, Walter was out checking the lighting in the backyard with Lila. Joanne watched from the kitchen window as Lila reached up to adjust a string of lights, her arm brushing Walter's shoulder. He didn't step away. Joanne's stomach tightened. Something inside her shifted from uneasy suspicion to quiet certainty. She said nothing when he came back inside, smelling faintly of Lila's floral perfume. She just smiled and asked if everything was ready for tomorrow. Inside, she was already making a different kind of plan. By Saturday morning, the yard looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Tables draped in red and white checkered cloths stretched across the lawn, each one set with mason jars of fresh-cut wildflowers. The smoker was already going, sending ribbons of hickory-scented smoke curling into the warm summer air. Walter had been outside since dawn, claiming he needed to babysit the brisket. When Joanne stepped out with a tray of lemonade, she found he wasn't alone. Lila was there again, perched on the edge of a lawn chair in shorts so short, Joanne wondered if she'd forgotten part of her outfit. In her lap sat a pitcher, and she was cutting watermelon into perfect little cubes, as if she'd been born for the task. Walter was bent over the smoker, explaining for the third time that week the secret to perfect ribs. "You have to keep the temperature steady," Walter said, glancing over his shoulder at Lila. "Can't rush good meat, Lila." She gave a soft, deliberate laugh, the kind that poured like honey into a man's ear. Joanne set the lemonade down on the table a little harder than she intended. "Everything going okay out here?" she asked. "Perfect," Walter said without looking at her. "Couldn't do this without her." The way he said it, like Lila was indispensable, made something clench inside Joanne. She had been running this BBQ for over 40 years, with or without Walter. And now suddenly, Lila was the one who made it happen? Joanne forced a smile. "Glad to hear it. I'm sure the guests will appreciate all the effort." "Of course they will," Lila replied brightly, as if she were co-hosting. "Walter's the best at these things." The best. Joanne's husband. Joanne's event. Joanne's home. And Lila spoke like she owned a piece of it. By late morning, Walter had Lila trailing him everywhere, from the backyard to the garage, from the grill to the drink station. He didn't ask Joanne where anything was. He asked Lila. "Lila, can you grab the tongs?" "Lila, the ice is in the cooler." Guests began arriving in the early afternoon, pulling up in trucks and sedans, carrying dishes to add to the spread. Children dashed across the lawn, chasing each other between the tables. The air was full of chatter and the mouth-watering smell of slow-cooked meat. And through it all, Lila stayed close to Walter like a shadow. She brushed his arm when she passed him a plate. She leaned in to whisper something, her hand briefly resting on his back. If anyone thought it odd, they didn't say, though Joanne noticed more than one pair of eyes dart between them. Her friend Connie arrived just as Walter and Lila were setting up the cornhole boards. "You holding up, Joe?" Connie asked, pressing a jar of her homemade pickles into Joanne's hands. Joanne hesitated. "Why wouldn't I be?" Connie's eyes flicked toward Walter and Lila. "Just wondering if you've noticed what everyone else has." The words landed heavy. Joanne had been telling herself she was reading too much into things, but if Connie had noticed, if everyone else had noticed, then it wasn't just in her head. Joanne swallowed hard and forced a laugh. "Oh, you know Walter, always making friends." Connie didn't look convinced. By 3 o'clock, the BBQ was in full swing. Music floated from the old speakers set up on the porch. People laughed, talked, and sipped sweet tea. From the outside, the day looked perfect. But for Joanne, it felt like she was watching a slow-motion play she had seen before, the kind where everyone pretended not to notice the affair unfolding in plain sight. Walter called Lila over to help baste the ribs, standing so close their shoulders touched. Lila laughed again, tilting her head toward him, her hair brushing his arm. The electricity between them was almost visible. Joanne said nothing. Not yet. While they played their little game, she began to think about hers. By mid-afternoon, the BBQ had reached that sweet spot where food was plentiful. The music was loud enough for private conversations, and the summer heat had softened everyone's edges. Laughter rose over plates piled high with ribs, potato salad, and peach cobbler. Children darted between tables, their bare feet kicking up tufts of grass. But beneath the cheerful hum was another current, one Joanne could feel running just under the surface. She saw it in the way people's eyes flicked from the grill to her, then back again. They weren't watching the brisket. They were watching Walter and Lila. The two moved around the yard like seasoned dance partners in their own orbit. Lila leaned close to pass him a serving tray, her lips brushing his ear with a whisper. Walter laughed a little too loudly, his hand lingering on hers as he took it. And people noticed. When Walter excused himself to grab another rack of ribs from the garage, Joanne overheard their neighbor Harold muttering to his wife, "They're not even trying to hide it." His wife hushed him, glancing nervously toward Joanne. Joanne carried a tray of cornbread to the buffet table, her smile fixed in place. She had been to enough church socials and family gatherings to know that in small towns, gossip spread faster than butter on a hot biscuit. And today, her yard was a frying pan. Connie reappeared beside her, refilling her iced tea. "You sure you're all right, Joe?" "I'm fine," Joanne replied, her tone just a touch too bright. "You know," Connie said quietly, "if you ever wanted to, make a point. Today's the day. You've got half the county here." Joanne gave a small, measured smile. "I'll keep that in mind." From across the yard, Walter and Lila stood by the cooler. Lila laughed, tossing her hair, one manicured hand resting lightly on Walter's chest. He didn't step back. Instead, he looked at her with a softness Joanne hadn't seen directed at herself in years, the kind that made a woman's gut twist in ways she couldn't quite put into words. A few guests openly stared, though. Joanne's cousin Janice, who had the subtlety of a marching band, whispered something to her husband while looking straight at them. He gave her a warning nudge, but not before Joanne caught the faint smirk on his face. Lila, either oblivious or emboldened, seemed to double down. She called Walter Walt, a nickname no one else used. She slipped him a rib from the platter before anyone else had been served. She even announced to the table nearest them that she was learning all of Walter's cooking secrets. That last comment made a few people glance at Joanne. Some with sympathy, some with the kind of hungry curiosity that only grew when trouble was brewing. Inside, Joanne's decision solidified. For weeks she had been turning over her suspicions like stones, afraid to look too closely at what lay beneath. But here, under the Georgia sun, with friends and family watching, the truth was no longer hiding. Walter caught her eye from across the lawn. For just a second, she saw something flicker there. Maybe guilt, maybe defiance. Then Lila spoke to him and he looked away, his hand brushing her back as they walked toward the smoker. Joanne took a slow breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver when she greeted another guest. Outwardly, she was the same gracious hostess she had been for 40 years. But in her mind, she was already drawing the outline of what was going to happen. If they wanted to play this game in her yard, in front of her people, she would use her yard, her people, and her moment to end it. When it was over, they would wish they had kept their little affair behind closed doors. The sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows across the yard, and the air felt heavier not from the heat, but from the weight of what Joanne was about to see. Guests were scattered across the lawn, plates balanced on their knees, conversations easy and unhurried. Walter slipped away again, muttering something about checking the next rack of ribs. Joanne watched him head toward the garage, and right on cue, Lila followed, balancing a pitcher of sweet tea like she was bringing water to a man lost in the desert. Joanne didn't follow right away. That would have looked suspicious. Instead, she made a slow loop around the yard, collecting empty plates, smiling at guests, nodding at conversations she wasn't hearing. Her feet carried her toward the garage door without urgency. but her heart beat in the low, steady rhythm it always found before something inevitable. The garage door was half open, letting in a stripe of light from the driveway. Inside, Walter stood with his back to her, his hands on the table where the meat rested. Lila was right beside him, far closer than any neighbor needed to be. She leaned in, saying something low, and her hand brushed his arm, then lingered there. Joanne couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She had been married long enough to recognize the kind of silence that came when two people were speaking in a language meant only for each other. Walter glanced toward the open garage door, his eyes scanning the yard, and for a second, Joanne thought he might see her. But then Lila laughed that soft, deliberate laugh, and his attention snapped back to her. Joanne stepped back before either of them spotted her. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But her mind sharpened like a blade. It was no longer suspicion. It wasn't even raw anger. It was purpose. She had spent years thinking of herself as the peacemaker, the glue, the one who smoothed over the rough edges of her marriage and made it all look easy from the outside. But something about seeing Walter in that garage, with Lila's hand on him in her home, her yard, her event, flipped a switch inside her. She wouldn't cause a scene without preparation. That wasn't her way. This would be deliberate, controlled, memorable. Back in the kitchen, Joanne pulled out her phone and scrolled to the folder she had almost deleted 2 weeks earlier, the one Connie had sent her. Inside were a handful of photos, taken by someone who had spotted Walter's truck outside a motel on the edge of town. The images weren't crystal clear, but they didn't have to be. Walter's profile was unmistakable, as was the curve of Lila's shoulder as they walked in together, the intimacy between them obvious even without words. Joanne had tucked the photos away, unsure if she truly wanted to face the truth. But now, with those garage shadows burned into her mind, she was sure. She sent a quick text to Connie. "Tonight. Be ready." The reply came within seconds. "What do you need?" "Mick, slideshow, and your voice if I start shaking," Joanne wrote back. From the yard, she heard Walter's laugh float in, followed by Lila's. It didn't rattle her. This time it steeled her. She stepped back outside, slipping into hostess mode as if nothing had changed. She refilled glasses, complimented potato salads, asked after people's children and parents. All the while she kept one eye on Walter and Lila, watching how they touched, how they moved, how they forgot the world around them. It wouldn't be long now. Just a few more hours until the evening toast, the moment when everyone gathered close, quiet enough to hear every word. When that moment came, Walter and Lila wouldn't just be caught. They would be caught in the most public way possible, right where they thought they were safest. The thing about hosting an event was that Joanne controlled the rhythm. She knew when the crowd was loud enough that whispers got lost, when the music covered conversations, and when the energy shifted just enough to draw every eye toward the center. She had been reading that rhythm all day, and now it was time to bend it to her purpose. Walter was holding court near the smoker again, talking to Harold and a few others, with Lila hovering close enough to refill his glass before he even asked. Joanne let her gaze slide past them, as if they were part of the scenery. Men like Walter often mistook a woman's quiet for weakness, never realizing it could be strategy. In reality, Joanne was already moving pieces into place. She slipped into the house where Connie was waiting by the kitchen counter with a look that said she'd been expecting her. "You're going through with it?" Connie asked in a low voice. "Yes," Joanne said, pulling her phone from her pocket. "But I need your help making sure everyone's watching when it happens." Connie grinned the kind of grin belonging to someone who had witnessed more than her share of small-town scandals. "You just tell me when." Joanne scrolled to the photos again, grainy. Yes, but unmistakable. Walter and Lila outside the Pine Grove Motel, his hand at the small of her back, their faces tilted toward each other with the kind of closeness that stripped away any claim to innocence. She had more than enough. "I'm thinking right before dessert," Joanne told her. "When people have eaten, they're relaxed. They've got a drink in their hand. They'll pay attention." Connie nodded. "We can use my tablet. Bigger screen." "I want it on the TV in the living room too," Joanne added. "We'll say it's for a slideshow of the BBQ over the years." "Consider it done," Connie said, and were already pulling out her phone. Back outside, the sun had begun its slow slide toward the horizon, painting the yard in golden light that made everything look softer than it really was. People clustered in small groups, some tossing beanbags at the cornhole boards, others leaning against the porch railing with drinks in hand. Joanne moved among them, topping off glasses, laughing at jokes. The picture of a gracious hostess. She made sure to speak to the guests who had the biggest mouths, the ones who could ensure no one slipped away early. "Don't leave before the toast," she said lightly. "We've got a little surprise this year." It wasn't a lie. Walter noticed nothing. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than ever, comfortable in his role and oblivious to the eyes that had been following him and Lila all day. Lila leaned against the side of the smoker now, her glass of sweet tea in hand, watching Walter with a smile that belonged to someone who thought she'd already won. In the kitchen, Joanne checked the setup. The tablet was connected to the TV. The slideshow folder was ready, starting with warm, harmless pictures from past BBQs. Kids with sticky faces. Walter at the grill. Friends gathered around tables. Midway through, Connie had inserted the motel photos, each one set to linger just long enough for recognition to settle in. After that, the images would fade to black. Perfect. Joanne poured herself a glass of sweet tea and stepped onto the porch, letting the sounds of the BBQ wash over her, the clink of ice in glasses, the thud of beanbags hitting wooden boards, the low murmur of conversations. The stage was set. All that was left was timing. Dessert would be the signal. People would gather close, expecting a thank you speech and maybe a few laughs about past events. And then, with one clean turn of the story, Joanne would give them something they would never forget. Out in the yard, Walter caught her eye and raised his glass, smiling like they were still the couple everyone thought they were. She smiled back not because she meant it, but because the best performances always save the twist for the final act. And hers was coming. By the time dessert came out, the sky had turned a deep peach and gold glow that only a Georgia summer could create. The air was thick with the smell of cobbler and grilled peaches, and guests drifted toward the long tables again, paper plates in hand. Joanne stood at the head of the table nearest the porch steps, a microphone in her hand, under the pretense of making a thank you announcement. Walter was only a few feet away, laughing with Harold, while Lila leaned against the porch railing, her plate balanced delicately in one hand. She tapped the mic once, just enough to get the nearest heads to turn. "If I can have everyone's attention for just a moment," she said, smiling as if this was the most natural thing in the world. A few people called out, "Speech," and "Tell us something good." The mood was light exactly where Joanne needed it. "I just want to start by saying how much Walter and I appreciate you all being here," she began. 41 years of BBQs is a long time, and some of you have been here for every one of them. We've shared meals, laughs, even some tears on this lawn. It's a tradition we've been proud to host." Walter smiled at her, relaxed, unaware. "And traditions," she continued, are built on something very important: trust. Without trust, you don't have much of a foundation, whether it's a neighborhood or a marriage. That line made a few people glance at each other, their smiles faltering slightly. Walter shifted his weight, a faint crease forming between his brows. I've always believed in being honest with the people who matter, Joanne said, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. And you all matter to me, which is why tonight I think it's time to share a different kind of memory. She nodded toward Connie, who stood by the porch steps with the tablet in hand. Connie gave a subtle nod back and tapped the screen. The big TV in the living room, visible through the wide-open sliding glass doors, lit up with the first image. Children from 10 years ago, faces sticky with BBQ sauce. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The next picture, Walter at the grill, holding up a perfectly smoked brisket. More smiles. Then came the shift. The next image wasn't from a BBQ. It was the parking lot of the Pine Grove Motel. Walter's truck, clear as day, sat parked under the dim glow of the lot's single lamppost. A murmur moved through the guests. The next slide, Walter and Lila, walking side by side toward one of the doors, his hand at the small of her back. The air changed. The cicadas still sang, but the human noise went still. Another image. The two of them standing close, her head tilted up toward his face bent toward hers. It wasn't grainy enough to save them. Everyone could see exactly what it was. Now, Joanne said into the mic, her voice steady, I could have kept this to myself. I could have pretended not to notice the whispers, or the looks, or the fact that the woman standing at my BBQ tonight has been spending more of her free time with my husband than I have. But I think you all deserve to know who you're breaking bread with. Walter's face turned a strange shade between red and white. Joanne, he started, but she lifted a hand. No, she said sharply, the mic catching the edge in her voice. You don't get to talk right now. Lila's smile collapsed entirely. She set her plate down with a small clatter and stepped back from the railing, her eyes darting toward the street like she was measuring the distance to her car. Around them, the silence was taut. Guests stood frozen, some with forks halfway to their mouths, others staring openly, unblinking. This, Joanne said, gesturing toward the screen as the final image lingered, is what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. And I may have been kind for 41 years, but I am not weak. The final image on the screen froze like it was holding its breath. Walter and Lila in that motel doorway, her hand on his chest, his head bent toward hers. The crowd stood in silence, the only movement the slow turning of heads toward the two of them. Walter stepped forward, hands half raised as if he could wave away the evidence. Joanne, this isn't— Don't, she said into the mic, her voice low but slicing through the thick air. We all know what it is. Lila's face was pale under the porch light, her jaw tight. This is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice trembling. A misunderstanding? Joanne let the word hang for a beat. Is that what you call checking into a motel an hour out of town on a Tuesday afternoon? Is that what you call the weeks of helping with BBQ prep in short shorts, making sure half the neighborhood could see exactly where your hands were? A couple of people near the buffet table looked away, uncomfortable. Others, the ones who had been whispering all afternoon, didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Walter tried again, his voice tight. We should talk about this in private. Joanne shook her head slowly. No, you chose to make it public when you brought her into my home, into our tradition, and paraded her around like I wouldn't notice. You involved all these people the moment you decided to be careless. Now you can face them. Gasps and murmurs swelled through the yard. Harold's wife clutched her glass of sweet tea like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Connie stood off to the side, arms folded, watching like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Walter's jaw tightened. "Joe, you're making a scene." "No," Joanne said evenly. "You and Lila made a scene. I'm just providing the audience." The line drew a sharp inhale from someone behind her and a faint chuckle from near the cornhole boards. Lila took a small step toward the porch steps. "I should go." "Yes," Joanne said, turning toward her. "You should. And take him with you." Walter blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. You're not finishing the night here. You've lost the privilege of being in this yard." She pointed toward the street, her tone calm but absolute. "Go on?" For a moment, it seemed like Walter might refuse dig in his heels, try to assert control. But then he glanced at the faces around him, the people he had eaten and laughed with for years, all staring at him with something between pity and judgment. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly. He looked at Lila, then at the street, and finally muttered, "Fine." The two of them moved toward the driveway, their walk brisk but awkward under the weight of dozens of eyes. No one spoke to them. No one reached out. The cicadas were the only sound until Lila's car engine turned over and carried them down the street. Joanne let the silence hang for another beat, then turned back to the crowd. "Well," she said, setting the microphone on the table, "I believe the cobbler's still warm." The tension broke with a ripple of nervous laughter from a few guests. Others moved toward Joanne, some offering quiet words of support, others giving her the subtle nod of respect reserved for those who had just taken back control in spectacular fashion. Connie slipped her arm through Joanne's. "You all right?" she asked softly. Joanne nodded, though a strange lightness had settled over her. She wasn't happy, not yet, but she felt unburdened. "I will be," she replied. The BBQ didn't crumble after Walter and Lila's departure. In fact, the laughter seemed freer, the conversations warmer, the food more enjoyable than it had been all day. Without the constant undercurrent of whispers and sidelong glances, the event felt like it belonged to Joanne again. By the time the last guest left, the Georgia night had settled in. The air cooler, the yard quiet except for the faint hum of crickets. Joanne stood on the porch, looking at the space where Walter had stood hours earlier, thinking about the years she had spent making sure everyone else was comfortable. Tonight, she had finally made sure she was. The next morning, the yard still smelled faintly of smoke and peaches. Folding chairs were stacked neatly along the fence, and the red and white tablecloths hung on the line, fluttering in the early breeze. It was almost peaceful, except for the empty spot in the driveway where Walter's truck usually sat. He hadn't come home after leaving with Lila. Not that Joanne expected him to. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sun rise over the pecan trees. There was a strange clarity in the air, the kind that came after a storm when the wind had cleared out the heaviness and left only clean sky. Her phone buzzed before she finished the first sip. It was Connie, of course. "You're a legend this morning. Harold said it's all over town already." Joanne typed back, "Let them talk." And talk they did. By noon, she had heard from 3 different people: the pastor's wife, her cousin Janice, and the woman who ran the diner, each calling under the guise of checking in, but clearly fishing for details. Joanne gave them the same response. "You saw what you saw. That's all there is to it." In a small Georgia town, that was all it took. The story bloomed on its own. By Monday, Joanne learned that Lila had put her house on the market. Perhaps she couldn't handle the stares, the whispers, or the sideways glances from neighbors who now knew the full story. Walter, she heard, was staying with his older brother in Macon. No phone calls, no notes, no attempt to explain, perhaps because he knew there was nothing left to explain. That silence suited Joanne just fine. She didn't want apologies. Apologies were for mistakes, not choices. And what Walter had done was deliberate. In the days that followed, Joanne found herself moving through the house differently. She had expected it might feel empty without him, but it didn't. It felt hers. The kitchen counters were no longer cluttered with his half-finished projects. The living room no longer smelled faintly of his cologne. The air was lighter in a way she hadn't realized she had been craving. On Wednesday, she stopped by the hardware store to buy a new lock for the front door. The clerk, a wiry man who had been at the BBQ, didn't ask questions. He simply rang up the purchase with a quiet nod that said he understood exactly why she was buying it. By Friday, the locks had been changed. Walter's clothes cleared from the closet, and the rest of his belongings boxed and placed neatly in the garage. If he wanted them, he could collect them without crossing her threshold. It wasn't vengeance. It was boundaries. And boundaries, Joanne had learned, were the truest form of self-respect. That weekend, she hosted a smaller gathering, just Connie, Harold's wife, and a couple of close friends. They sat on the porch with lemonade, the conversation easy and full of laughter. There were no sidelong glances, no undercurrent of gossip, only people who had shown up because they cared. At one point, Connie leaned over and said, "You know, Joe, most folks would have kept quiet. Saved face." Joanne smiled into her glass. "Maybe. But saving face isn't worth losing yourself. I'd rather live in truth than sit quiet while someone else rewrites it." Connie nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant Joanne had put something into words her friend would carry with her. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Joanne stood on the porch again, watching the sun set in soft streaks of gold and rose. She thought about the years she had spent making the BBQs perfect, making her life look perfect, holding everything together for the sake of appearances. And she realized something appearances didn't hold you when the truth finally came calling. Only self-respect did. The cicadas started their evening chorus, their song rising into the warm air, and Joanne felt a calm she hadn't known in years. She had been betrayed, yes, humiliated maybe, but she had also stood her ground in front of everyone who mattered. She had looked the truth in the face and refused to look away. And in a town where people remembered everything, they would remember that, too.